Well, welcome everybody. This is Randy Welsh, the Executive Director for the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance, along with Dave Cantrell, our Program Chair of NWSA. Here today with me is David Gessner. He's an author of 12 books that blend the love of nature, humor, memoir, and environmentalism, including his latest, Quiet Desperation, Savage Delight, Sheltering with Thoreau in the Age of Crisis. And one of the books that we really had wanted to have him come on and talk about is Leave It As It Is, A Journey Through Theodore Roosevelt's American Wilderness. So David is a professor at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where he's also the founder and editor-in-chief of the literary magazine Ecotone. His own magazine publications include pieces in the New York Times Magazine, Outside, Sierra, Audubon, Orion, many others. With having over 12 books, Dave has been quite prolific. So we're really pleased that David would choose to join us today. And so to kick off our session, our coffee hour, we just wanted to have David tell us a little bit about how you got involved in environmental writing first.
Thanks, Randy. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it. Well, I'll give you a short answer and then a much too long answer, because I was planning on talking about writing a little before I got into environmentalism anyway. The short answer is the first paragraph of my latest book, which is about sheltering during the pandemic with Thoreau. I went from Teddy Roosevelt to Thoreau. One killed a lot less things, but both were equally passionate about the outdoors. So this is the first paragraph. 16 years ago, when our daughter was just a baby, my wife and I took her on a trip to Walden Pond. As we approached the place where Henry David Thoreau's cabin once stood, with my daughter riding up on my shoulders, I said to her, "That's where the man lived who ruined your father's life." Ruined in a good way, I mostly meant, but it suddenly law school and being a doctor or whatever went out the window, and I was in high school kind of just romanticizing and writing and thinking that this was the way for me. People would all warn me that I was going to be impoverished. They were right. It turns out that's not just a cliche. But that was kind of the beginning of the writing for me. The longer answer, and maybe the slightly more serious answer, is I really didn't set out to write about nature or the environment or conservation. And though I had that early influence of Thoreau, like a lot of young people, I was just very ambitious about my writing. And as I said, I got out of college, and apparently there wasn't a well-paying job for writer, and I worked as a carpenter and a bookstore clerk for almost a decade while I wrote these large Thomas Wolfean sprawling failed novels that I wanted to put on the doorstep of my Max Perkins and have the world celebrate me, and that did not happen. I think of those books now as kind of nurse logs, old decaying things that new growth comes out of. And one of my dark secrets as a nature writer is that I'm from Worcester, Massachusetts. And and there are natural wonders nearby, but it doesn't, beauty and the natural world don't spring to mind when you think of Worcester. So when I was 29, I moved back to Worcester because my girlfriend was going to medical school there. And during the course of the year, found out I had testicular cancer. And people think it's a joke, but I really did write in my journal, I don't know what's worse, cancer or Worcester, at one point. And it was really the worst year of my life. And weirdly, the operation occurred on the week of my 30th birthday, which kind of divided my life into a before and after. And then during the month of May in Worcester, I had radiation therapy. And it was so strange to see the blooming occur. Believe me, I'm getting to wilderness. Don't worry. I'll speed it up now. And the blooming was occurring while I was feeling sick and all that. But I'd done one productive thing during that year, which was apply to graduate schools in creative writing. And during that month, I slowly got rejected by one after another of those schools, adding to my overall mood. And the last chance I had, and the one I got into, was in Boulder, Colorado. And so at 30, after I felt a little better, I packed up an unregistered car. My dad had insisted that it was stupid to register a car in Massachusetts when I was going to have to re-register it in Colorado. So I drove across the country. And as cliche as it sounds, I could have been listening to Rocky Mountain High, but I started to cry a little when I saw the mountains. And I moved into a little cabin in El Dorado Springs, and it was kind of the second part of my life. I wrote my first book, and this is a weird thing that writers will do, about loving Cape Cod, which was my first nature, while in the mountains of Colorado. I then moved back to Cape Cod because it wouldn't do for a Cape Cod nature writer to be in Colorado, and wrote a book about loving the mountains and recovering from cancer in the mountains. And so, and it's not that unusual for writers to do that, to see a place better when they step back from it. And I said for a nature writer there, but in fact, I did not think of myself that way. My early work had all been fiction, big novels. This was a nonfiction memoir. My dad had died of cancer the same year I had cancer. So it was kind of this grim facing of the reality, but also a celebration of the natural world. The first book was called A Wild Rank Place. And the full title is a quote from Thoreau: "It is a wild, rank place, and there is no flattery in it." That might not sound like the Cape Cod of Kennedys and yacht clubs, but it is the Cape Cod of February, when you can see the humpback whales breaching and you can see, the gannets diving. So those two books, which in my mind were really about my life and mortality, were called nature books by the critics. And suddenly I found myself becoming this thing called a nature writer. And so my third book was called Sick of Nature. It was my rebellion from the genre. Of course, I wasn't sick of nature. Of course, I love the natural world. But I didn't like, and this will get to kind of what we're going to be talking about, I didn't like being boxed in. I didn't like being told what I was doing was small, was like, and antiquated, like Scrimshaw or something. And so I wanted to say, you're thinking of nature as in this small box off to the side. Nature's the big show. This is where, this is not a small thing. Then a bizarre thing happened. An editor read Sick of Nature, and for the first time I got an advance, and she asked me to do a nature book. And so to hell with it, whole hog, I was all in. I wrote a book about spending a year watching ospreys on Cape Cod and following them through the nesting and the fledglings fledging, and really got absorbed in it. And that's when I started to accept the title nature writer, but I wanted to redefine it. So one of the books, I wrote a bunch of other books, but one of the books I wanted to start by mentioning because it's relevant to today. Unfortunately, this is my only copy that looks like it's been chewed by a wolverine, but it's called My Green Manifesto. And it was a book about, I had an old friend, I was an ultimate Frisbee player, and I had a friend named Dan Driscoll, who we used to call Danimal in the old days. And Dan had greened the Charles, the banks of the Charles River in Boston, by way of bike paths. He'd kind of Trojan horsed in a way to return native plantings through bringing bike packs back. He worked for the state, and he had this vision that really came to fruition. He's a local hero there too, Dan Driscoll. And Dan was really helpful for me in kind of redefining my environmentalism in a few ways. For one thing, and we all know this, if you drive a car or take a flight, you're called a hypocrite. That's the thing that's always used to bring down environmentalists. And Dan was the one who said to me, if they say we drive or we do this, they call us a hypocrite. He said, well, I need hypocrites. I need more hypocrites who fight. And I really like that. And also at the time, and this is early 2000s, the book was a little bit of a pushback about climate change or nothing. The book I'm working on right now is all about climate change, so obviously, but at the time I was like, you know what? Local fights still matter. Dan's fight still mattered. And I made a kind of passionate case for what I called the limited wild, right? This is a city of millions, Boston, and a river kind of sneaking through the backyards, but you would see the heron colonies and you would see fox along the way. And I was saying, we have to appreciate the wild that is. The Western books obviously tend to be bigger, but this one was a kind of a celebration of small nature, and of basically saying you can't fight for something you don't love, and fighting a little back about NIMBYism, because it's not so bad to fall in love with your backyard. You fight for what you love, and that's often where the love starts. Also, I think, even though I didn't say anything funny, it's a pretty funny book because it's us going down a canoe down the Charles in an epic Lewis and Clark adventure that is not at all epic. And we stop at a steakhouse and have martinis. So anyway, this was one of my books that started to get me rethinking. And then another one, which is probably the book that's gotten the most traction, is All the Wild That Remains. I guarantee you, I suspect that somebody in this group read Desert Solitaire when they were younger and it changed their lives, because I've always run into people who have. I did not encounter Abby until later in my 20s, but like a lot of people, Ed Abbey fired me up as an activist and doing more. And it's weird, these papers from when I used to do Abbey talks fell out of this. And I just thought I'd read a couple very short Abbey quotes that, to me, get at why he still matters, though I am going to talk about inclusiveness. And certainly Ed, we need to push back against Ed in ways. And I'm here not only to evade for a while the clamor and filth and confusion of the cultural apparatus, but also to confront immediately and directly, if possible, the bare bones of existence, the elemental and fundamental, the bedrock which sustains us. On this bedrock of animal faith, I take my stand. And what I tried to do in the course of this book was contrast Abbey's environmentalism with Stegner's environmentalism. At the time, I had just turned 50, and my Abbey days were waning, and I was thinking about my Stegnerian future and kind of the more, not just intellectual and professorial approach, but also the in the trenches, boring, attending meeting sort of environmental work that Stegner, exemplified, and also the large thinking about climate and about geography that Stegner did so brilliantly. For instance, when I left the West and moved back to Cape Cod, I saw it in a totally new way in terms of the sandy soil and in terms of the geography of it. And I really thank Stegner for that, his great and brilliant thinking on aridity in the West. So this book kind of worked those two back and forth against each other, not always against each other, though they did irritate each other quite a bit. And that kind of got me back to the West. Long ago in High Country News, I had an essay called The Polygamists of Place. It contrasted my love of places with heroes like Wendell Berry and Henry David Thoreau, who talked of place in terms of marriage and finding the one place on earth that they would commit to. And I said, in contrast, I married several places, sandy soil of the Cape, Colorado mountains, Utah, and now, grudgingly, I'm admitting the southern coast of North Carolina, where I've been now for 18 years. So that's part one. Randy, that was a long answer, I know. And now we're catching up to leave it as it is. Do you have any like palate cleansing, take a break while I take a sip of water questions?
You bet, Dave. So no, that's great. I think I share a lot of interest in some of the same books and same authors that you were talking about. I've got a conservation library that's full of those folks. So I think the question that a lot of folks will want to know is, what's your affinity with wilderness and your experience with wilderness, and how has that shaped some of the writings that you have gotten? And that might be a lead into Leave It As It Is, and discussion about Teddy Roosevelt, who, as we all can admit, was one of the great conservationists of the 19th century.
Yeah, as I get into Teddy, one of the things I'm going to do, I have an article that I sent you a link to, and maybe you can forward to everybody, and it's called Taking Down Teddy, about taking down the statues. And since the book is in large part about Bears Ears and a Native American movement, and since Teddy's record when it comes to Native Americans isn't great, we live kind of in an either-or culture. We take them down or we celebrate, right? And what I try to do is take what was good and strong about Roosevelt and the vision, looking at it as kind of a first draft, criticize it, and add, as I'll get into, new ideas, more inclusive ideas, including Native American ideas, and have a kind of confluence of those two. But that doesn't answer your question. What I was going to say about Roosevelt is, whatever else we say about him, he had a primal physical love of being in wilderness. He exalted and exulted in it. And I would say at the time, it's funny because I think for some people, books help. I just quoted Abby, right? That we have it on a physical, basic level. I always loved being outdoors. I was an athlete, but I also was, a big skier and an outdoors person. But I do think that, and I suspect it's true for a lot of people, the romance about outdoors was both a physical pleasure and the intellectual thread of those who had loved the outdoors before me. And so that was always something that I did when I still lived in Massachusetts, backpacking. But of course, it amped up when I moved to Boulder and Colorado. And then when I discovered, like so many people have, Southeast Utah, where I spent so much time. And as the years have passed, I've divided my life between long stints right here at this desk and trips like the one I just took, where I followed the Colorado 10 days, when could hike into the source because there was so little snow. This was early December. So I hiked to the source and then followed it by plane and by hiking down. And I guess without that, my life would kind of suck. I love writing. I get a great pleasure out of it, but I need to have its opposite. Churchill said, "A change is as good as a rest." And that's just, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of people here. Just on a physical, basic level, it frees me up. And I also find often that words, as a writer, words come to me when I'm in beautiful places. That and I'm a birder, so that's another thing in terms of just the metaphor of kind of liberation, like seeing birds in flight, kind of lifting you out of your own kind of monkey wheel brain and your own claustrophobic thoughts. I find like that's a big part of it. So I'll edge into the Roosevelt book, Leave It As It Is. And I'll just, a little backstory. I was asked, I just published a book with Torrey House Press, which is a nonprofit in Utah. But Torrey House and Stephen Kimball contacted me during the last couple of years of Obama's administration. And at the time, Bears Ears they were pushing forward the idea of Bears Ears as a national monument. And they had a bunch of us write for a small book, Red Rock Testimony, that was distributed to all the members of Congress. And I joked, there were a lot of Native writers, there were mostly Western writers. I joked I was the token Easterner. And I think for a lot of us, when that passed, we felt having spent a lot of time in Bears Ears, Cedar Mesa already as a younger person, we felt a real personal sense of triumph at that moment. And of course, the Native people who had worked so hard to give the draft of the monument and work toward it, the Dene felt much more exhilaration. So this book came about because really the moment was I'd already been thinking a lot about Roosevelt and what we could take from him and what we could reject from him. And I thought one thing we could take is boldness. One thing this book touches on that I bet people know about here is the Y2Y project, right? Yellowstone to Yosemite to Yukon, and the idea of massive connective wilderness and moving up, and the overpasses, the vegetated overpasses and underpasses, and that to me seemed like a Rooseveltian idea. Like when he had that was similar. The parks themselves were similar to that sort of idea that people weren't having, that they didn't get at first. And he had to describe and explain and excite and inspire them about why they were important. So with Bears Ears, I thought, and I'm going to get more into this, but I thought this is something unique, and I was very excited. And then on Roosevelt's birthday in the first Trump term, Zinke, in front of a portrait of Roosevelt and calling himself a Rooseveltian conservationist, began the process of undeclaring or eviscerating 85% of the Bears Ears National Monument. So that was kind of, I'd already been thinking about that stuff, about the boldness of Roosevelt. And then I was like, I'm going to do a book here. And I'm going to somehow conflate Roosevelt with Bears Ears. It's not that hard since the Antiquities Act was at the center of all this. So for people who know the writing world, nonfiction, you sell by proposal. I put a proposal out there. And then I went for, I think, Sierra Magazine out to do research in Utah. And the weird thing was, while I was out there, walking across Glen Canyon, by Lake Powell over the bridge, I got the call that the book had been accepted, which I thought was a kind of nice Ed Abbey sort of moment, like to have that happen. But I was very lucky in that the people I knew from SUA in Utah and the people I was talking to pointed me in the direction first of Regina Lopez White Skunk, who was the only female member of the Bears Ears commission that was created by the Dene the Navajo, had been studying Bears Ears as a possible national monument for 5 years. And that included cultural mapping, interviewing of elders, and one of the cliches of putting down the effort for Bears Ears was that it was kind of the moment, and that it was done in a rash way. And I remember Mark Maryboy, who was the first Native graduate of a state college in Utah, and then the first Native representative. He told me a story where he said in the 60s, a man named Robert Kennedy came to the reservation, and his parents had him, brought him to it and said, "This is an important man, I want you to listen to him. And Kennedy asked them what the pressing issues were. And they said to him, "We want you to save the Bears Ears, preserve the Bears Ears." So it wasn't of the moment flash in the pan, and years of work had gone into it. And then the tribes, who did not, 5 tribes, Navajo, Hopi, Mountain Ute, who else? Anyway, somebody put it in the comments. I have it in my head somewhere. Got together and they didn't get along. They were having water rights problems and fighting and everything. So hammering out the vision was no small thing. And so I sat down with Regina, and this is, I guess, right before it was officially eviscerated. But we knew it was coming. The fix was in. And Zuni was the one I missed. And she said, and I'll just quote, "Those first meetings were so intense, and we had really long meetings. We had to heal ourselves first. We agreed that when we met, all other issues, all other politics would stay outside. In the end, we would set our disagreements aside and focus on the conservation of the land, continued access to the land, and trying to keep the mining and the roads out." And this is important. She said, "While we were putting the proposal together, we worked really hard not to spend time recounting the historical trauma of the indigenous people. We didn't want to say, we want our land back. Ours was an effort to heal. We worked hard to stay away from terms like racism. We tried to focus on the light, not the darkness." And I told her I had a friend back in North Carolina who said he didn't object to Barry's ears, but it just wasn't what the Antiquities Act was made for. And she laughed. I had the Antiquities Act memorized. This is exactly what it's made for. And if you read the wording, the one thing you can object to in the wording is size. It was never originally intended to be millions of acres. But in terms of preserving the antiquities, Bears Ears is just thick, lousy with antiquities. And so she kind of laughed that one off. And she went to Washington and lobbied. And she said Obama sent her some little chocolates. And her main thing was saying how empowered she felt and how, for once, I think she was saying we were using the tools that had always been used against us, since we know the Antiquities Act. So many of the places from the very first one, Devil's Tower, were native land that was saved, but also taken away from those who had lived there. So she said, we're using this tool of the American government for us, and we're using it in a new way. And that to me was, right away changed the book, and was just this exciting idea that there could be a possible confluence. The tendency now, if we think of, I always think dogmatism is the enemy, right? So obviously, if we go on the extreme Trumpian side, we don't need to waste time poking holes in that. But the other side of dogmatism, Roosevelt said he always felt like he metaphorically was walking a high mountain ridge. And on the one side were those who cared only about money. And but on the other were thinkers who could only think one way. And this is what I mean by that. Roosevelt deserves to be criticized for his attitude toward Native people. If we're going to give him credit for being ahead of his time in a lot of things, like conservation, we got to hit him where he's not ahead of his time. But if you look at the platform he came back with, the Bull Moose platform in 1912, it would make Bernie blush. It's the stuff that FDR later brought out and made real, but it's already there in 1912, including women's right to vote and many social programs. So all I ask when we come to these figures, whether it's John Muir or Roosevelt, is we're fair and we're tough, but we also have historical empathy, and we ask ourselves how we would have dealt then. I think taking down the statue of Roosevelt is fine, because Roosevelt hated statues, and it's if you've seen it, you see why it's being done. On the other hand, taking him down, I have some problems with. So anyway, to keep going on Regina's.
So David, as a historical anecdote, I was in Washington, D.C. in our wilderness program office about 2012, where we had a delegation from the tribes come to talk to us about this Bears Ears Monument proposal. It was one of the first times that it had been brought up, and one of the things I remember most about it was the cooperative nature of the management that the tribes were proposing, and that was certainly something that we took a strong look at, and I think I'm hopeful that it will be implemented over time, because that does help bring that different perspective into the management of these ancient ancestral lands.
Yeah, I was just thinking too that a new way of thinking about this comes through in the proclamation itself too. I think the first proclamation for the antiquities, for a national monument that was approached poetry, and I think Charles Wilkinson had a lot to do with it, was Grand Staircase Escalante. But in Bears Ears, it's like a prose poem. I was going to start by saying, for me, thinking about this stuff, really, writing is how I think. There's the E.M. Forrester line, how can I know what I think until I hear what I say? And so writing is kind of how I work my way through these things. And the process of this book, where I thought it was going to go one way, and then more and more I was talking to either environmentalists who were sympathetic with Native causes or Native American environmental thinkers themselves, it started to go another way. And here's a lovely thing from the, I'll just read it. This is from the proclamation for Bears Ears. A key concluding sentence effectively connects Native knowledge of the place to the prime directive of the Antiquities Act. This is from the proclamation. The traditional ecological knowledge amassed by the Native Americans whose ancestors inhabited this region, passed down from generation to generation, offers critical insight into the historic and scientific significance of the area. In other words, Western values of science and study, values that led to the creation of the Antiquities Act, are not ignored. A different way of knowing is also put on the same plane, the same level with the scientific thinking. This is radical, this is new, this is a possible confluence. And then one final nice touch in the proclamation. This traditional way of understanding land is not just a way of knowing, it too is something that the Act must defend. Quote, such knowledge is itself a resource to be protected and used in understanding and managing this landscape sustainably for generations to come. So I love that the Antiquities Act is not just about protecting land, it's protecting kind of a way of being. I don't know if people have read Jack Turner's Abstract Wild. I guess it must be 20, 30 years old by now, Montana writer. But he talks about the uses of wilderness and being in wilderness, and not merely recreating and not preserving in a quote unquote pristine way, but experiencing it. And a lot of what the Bears Ears Native American community talks about is using the monument, native plants, traditions, ceremony, wood gathering, which was an issue kind of used by the other side, which wasn't valid because you were still allowed to gather wood there. And so that's been a nice thing to think of too, not thinking of, to me, it kind of counterbalances what you could call the Disneyfication of the national parks. And I always say there's an easy way to get around that. Wrong foot the seasons, right? Go to southern Utah in summer. Go to the parks but I through sheer bad luck, and I apologize to any Yosemite fans here, I've only been there twice in my life, and I've hit it at the tourist peak and have had to run away. The one time I ran away to the backcountry there and had an amazing night. And I guess that's the thing that Doug Peacock, aka Hayduk, said to me when I was doing the Abbey book. You look at Yellowstone, and you think of traffic jams while you're looking at wilderness, but all you got to do is go a mile off the road, and you're in a place where bears could get you. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit. What if we do some questions so I can, I mean, I guess one of the fun parts I would like to include in this story is right now Bears Ears is coming back to national monument status, and we did have the president of the United States quoting Ed Abbey in the White House, so that was kind of crazy. But I'll tell you what, I just went there, and it didn't look any different than when it wasn't a national monument, or it didn't look any different from before. Obama, and very little money, it seems like, has been put into doing anything. And that's another thing I'll say. I also went to Chimney Rock in Colorado. There's so much talk about overcrowding and overpopulating, but I do feel like national monuments, in my experience, versus national parks, are places that, particularly if you time it right, you can sometimes even have to yourself. And I've had that experience in Bears Ears, and just had it in Chimney Rock too. So anyway, get me back in line here. Give me some direction. I want to hear where people want to go. So.
All right. Well, let's open it up for some questions from the audience and see how we might further this conversation. And while we're waiting for some questions, David, maybe give your perspective on the conservation writing that you see happening today, and who do you think are the bright stars out there telling it like it is, besides yourself, of course?
Well, I guess I was lucky enough, a magazine called Orion, and years ago, in the old days, they would have these kind of think tank conferences. And the joke was, the editor Orion told me that they called them Barry, Gary, Terry, and Barry. And it was Gary, it was Barry Lopez, Gary Snyder, Terry Tempest Williams, Wendell Berry, and the old crew. And about 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, they decided to have a younger generation meeting. And the cutoff age was 45, but I always say I was let in by virtue of my immaturity. I was 48. But a lot of the writers I met there, and this was before diversity had taken such a big role. Mm-hmm. For instance, Drew Lanham, who's written a beautiful book called Home Place, and who gave the address for this year's Audubon conference, wrote a book about kind of a black man's Walden, basically, about in South Carolina, and I think it's a great book. And a lot of the other writers I met there, I'm a Craig Childs fan. He's kind of followed the Abbey tradition, but with more of a science base. The writers that I've published in Ecotone, I have a long list, but Janice Ray is another writer I like a lot. I'll tell you what, I'll send you a list. I'm getting nervous.
Okay, no, that's fine.
And if people want, if they're up for it, they can unmutify or when they want to ask their question, we could have them see the face.
Yeah, we'll have people raise their hand if they would like to speak on camera. So David, let's talk a little bit about the inclusiveness of conservation writing. As we think about that, we often think about affiliation with people that we feel comfortable with, and a lot of the writers in the past have been, white males. So how is the writing world looking at inclusiveness and expanding the voices of those that are different than the white male? Women and writers and minority writers. How do you see that happening these days? And what can we do to encourage that so that we get all voices into this conversation?
Well, I think it's happening right in front of our eyes right now. It's been a long time coming. And sometimes there's a little bit of a, you sometimes you question the motives, because now we've got something in vogue, but it's been growing. It's been growing. I just thought of, for instance, braiding sweetgrass is right, and I published with Milkweed, and it came out 9 years ago, and it was Susan just said High Country News has done a good job, and I actually am a big fan of their new editor, Jennifer Son, who is really going to do that and has done that with Orion. But Braiding Sweetgrass was a New York Times bestseller all of a sudden. So I think it is really happening. I think that we have to continue to encourage it. On the other hand, great writing is what carries the day, and giving more writers opportunity for great writing to get out there. I mean, I made the joke about Thoreau at first, and I mentioned Abbey, but I think of how many people have been turned on to the natural world, not just through the natural world itself, but through books. So why not have a diverse group of people be turned on by a diverse group of writers? I mean, in the circles that I'm in, you see it, there's a little bit of a lag time getting out to the real world, but I'm really happy. I could share my reading list from the last, nature writing class. Another great example is Linda Hogan, who was my teacher in Boulder, Native American writer who writes stunningly about animals. And I think Radiant Animals is her new book.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share that reading list out with our audience. We do have a question here about how would you suggest wilderness managers honor and share with the public the past Indigenous experience and use of wilderness areas around the country? From your example in Bears Ears and other places, how should managers go about sharing that information?
Well, since I'm in the room with 20 managers, I'll listen as much as talk on this one. It seems to me that what Roosevelt did well, and this goes back to kind of the Ian Forrester quote, was tell stories. I'm astounded by the fact that he made the environment a top priority in his administrations, in the first decade of the 20th century, where people could care less, right, about this issue that he made. And the reason he could do it was the passion of his storytelling. Now, to flip that over to the now, telling great stories about the native tradition on the land, which I think people are open to now, and not being reverse exclusive about it either, not being scolding. I mean, I think that's the problem. That's what I mean by that middle ground that Roosevelt walked, is to tell it and not have people recoil in defensiveness from it. It's a thrilling story, and it's a story obviously about the past, and it's a tragic story, but it's also a possibility going forward. And it's nice to, in anything you do, it's important to have role models. And what better role models for how to be on the land than people who were and are on the land. So, I mean, to me, it's storytelling that's huge, I think, and gets people
excited. All right. We have our first question. Jojo Matson, would you care to unmute yourself and share your question with David, the audience?
Hey, Jojo.
Hey there. So I'm an archaeologist and a master's student in environmental management on public lands at Western Colorado, doing a lot of the work that you're talking about. And one thing that I've been sort of wrapping my head around is exactly what you were just touching on, but how to actually incorporate storytelling from multiple perspectives, indigenous, localized, all of those components within our management strategies. And I guess this isn't necessarily a full-on question, but maybe a conversation point. But I think a big responsibility we have as not falling into the white savior complex as more as a supportive role is actually the education component to the greater public, particularly our backcountry users. And I wonder how, how you think that with storytelling, with particularly public reachable and science incorporated storytelling, we can start to navigate connecting to policy moves or education behind how we can start shifting our voting components, because I think that's one of the problems we're going to have moving forward that we've seen with the Bears Ears topic, is that every 4 years it sort of changes.
Sure.
And that we've done, just sort of gets ping-ponged to different directions. So we need to have it be a little bit more broader scoped to be able to combat that issue so that we can get movement in a progressive and longer term fashion.
Yeah, I think, first of all, you at your school have the only environmental writing grad program in the country that I know of. And my friend Karen Avignon is coming down there to teach next term. So that's storytelling. I think that my experience has been, I've been lucky. I've run into some great, my friend Lewis Williams is a great storyteller, Native American guide, might be the first, create the first guide service in Southeast, in the Bluff area. And that seems to be a really great way to get stories across. And I do feel like to some degree, the white savior thing, is real. On the other hand, if you're friends with people and you're trying to help them, that's okay. I want his rafting company to get going, so I'm going to try to support it. So I do feel like ways, the other thing that in my experience, I've been very lucky. In terms of dealing now, the climate has gotten worse, obviously, in the last years with Trump and everything. But I've always felt like it's better out in the world than it is on MSNBC and Fox. And I wrote a book called The Tarball Chronicles about the Gulf oil spill. And my protagonist in that was Ryan Lambert, who was a good old boy, hunter fisherman who had a fishing lodge. And the only thing we had in common was the land or the wetlands. And he would tease me and call Obama my president. And so I do feel like having conversations to the degree that it's possible now that include humor, complexity, hypocrisy, openness, messiness, without kind of being strict, is one way you can kind of do it. And I don't want to be naive about it, because I know how the party lines have hardened in recent years. But my experience in going places is, if there's any issue where there's an overlap, it's land. I mean, it might be you have totally opposite ideas and are fighting, but love of the land is where it starts. So at least there's that common thread. As far as the voting bloc, that one might be beyond me. I don't know. It's so scary. I'm doing the new book I'm doing is about the end of the world. So, and the first chapter is a triptych of ancient Pueblo and Chaco Canyon, basically. The houses near me that are underwater because of sea level rise, and the White House. Weirdly, I was a classmate of Jamie Raskin's, and I went up. That was the first trip I took after the pandemic, and I walked up to the White House. I mean, not the White House. I'm sorry, Congress, and on Capitol Hill. I walked up and it was completely empty, and I was just, was thinking, oh, this is like the Anasazi ruins, and it's like the house is on. So I don't know where. I'm feeling a little less optimistic about where we're headed, but I do feel like communication, openness, storytelling. One thing that's cool about it is problem solving is a big part of it. You go into a book and it's a hard thing to do. And your mind rises to the creative challenge. And I think it must be similar in your work, that you have to, there are these nutty problems that are unsolvable, and you have to try to do something creative with them.
So David, you mentioned, Teddy Roosevelt and the crisis that he was facing were the timber barons and the timber famines that were happening, and that was one of the major reasons he was so involved with setting aside large swaths of the forest preserves to protect that timber for the future. Right now, we're facing a different crisis, the climate crisis, which you've mentioned. Each day in the newspapers and radio, television, we hear about another new study that shows how we're poisoning the planet, and that climate is changing. So what can we expect from your book? What are the themes that you're going to look at in your new book about the climate crisis, and what could we look forward to, other than the end of the world?
That might be the wrong phrase, look forward to. But, I think on the new Maya Angelou coin, it might quote her as saying, I don't sing because I have an answer. The bird doesn't sing because it has an answer. It sings because it has a song. And I feel like so much of the writing about climate, and again, Bill McKibben was my classmate, and I admire him vastly, but it's just not, that's not that's not what I do, and so mine, in terms of, I'm not going to give you an answer. I mean, I'm not going to give you an answer now, but I'm not going to give you an answer in the book either. It's more, I started to travel last March, and in the 9 months that I traveled, without even trying, I saw, the Dixie Fire. I saw a flash flood at Ken Slight's house after their fire at Pack Creek above Moab. I came back. I went to a student of mine, great writer, Adam Ganussi, student's wedding, 2 weeks after the hurricane in New Orleans. I went out and just hiked in Colorado when it was the latest snow, front range snowfall ever, and picked up my daughter's best friend. She got to know her when we lived in Boulder, and she was flying out, and the house next door to hers had burnt down. It got that far in the Louisville fire, and meanwhile we had cyclones. And the thing I say to anybody who's telling me we're not in a new age is, look at my daughter's high school years. She missed her first term because of a hurricane. The Hurricane Florence came the next year, and you spread in a few school shootings and whatever, and then we had the pandemic. I mean, she's had one normal term in 4 years of high school. So I'm not really, I don't know if it's something for people to look forward to, though I do say in the introduction that we're going to have fun. I like to travel and do fun stuff and drink beer, but I mean, really, who can not say the last year has been, all these predictions of what the future is going to be like, and here we are inside of it. So I guess the only thing I would say is urgency. And it's hard to, we're going to go back to our things to do list and our priorities tomorrow. And meanwhile, this is really happening. We're really inside it. I don't know how helpful that is.
So what are some of the themes that we'll see in your new book?
Good question.
You wouldn't mind giving
I guess it's mostly trying to open one's eyes to what is right in front of us, and the fact that so many people, almost everyone I know has now been directly affected by climate. I live in a town where the only time it's on the national maps is when a hurricane is hurtling toward us. So I guess it's more like a wake-up call, not that we're going to wake up, and not that we haven't had other wake-up calls, but it is, I don't know, maybe I turned 60 this year, so maybe I'm just getting darker. That's all I can say. And I haven't written it yet, so back to the Ian Forrester quote, I'll see when I say it, sort of.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions in the.
I'm sad, people, that I'm not generating questions. It's like my class at school.
Well, speaking of school, what do you see the folks in the students in your current classes? What do they think about the environment? What kind of things do you hear from them about what they're worried about and also what they're excited about?
Well, I taught a grad student on environmental writing a while ago, and I was lucky enough to have a woman here start the local chapter of 360, the McKibben climate change thing, and I was really impressed by her. And to be less dark about the new book, that was one of my students becoming activists. Even if I don't become an activist, my students becoming activists is something that inspired me. And my daughter, who's given talks at town hall and here in Wilmington, and so to me that's exciting. On the other hand, I will say that I do want to, if I can find a way to do it, I do want to get back out west, and I do find, we're still, for all our sameness, we're still a very regional country, and I do find among young people a more active engagement with the natural world in the West, and actually in New England too, than the South. Sometimes it's frustrating being down here. Susan, I'm gonna ask these guys that. I'd love to know what people who know more than me have. Did you see that question, Randy?
Yeah, I do. Question is, do you see any future for increasing recommended wilderness for the forest plan revision process to meet 30 by 30 goals? And how slow will that process be? And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, David. I know that I do from my past.
Yeah, I'd love to listen.
I'd
like to learn a little.
Well, it's a little off topic, Susan, but I think that the recommended wilderness recommendations in the Forest Service planning process are going to be slow and far between. The time I left the Forest Service, there was about 5 million acres of land that was recommended for wilderness in the Forest Service plans at that time. And unless they get strong political direction from the administration, I just don't see the Forest Service having much political will to propose a lot of recommended wilderness in future forest planning processes. I think you'll see what's been proposed in the past will get proposed again in the future, but I doubt you'll see a lot of additional or extra that could be added to that mix. There's still 55 million acres of roadless lands within the National Forest System, 5 million of which have been recommended for wilderness as of about 2010. The idea would be to see maybe 15 to 20 million of that show up in wilderness bills. And I think you'll see it happen because of local support, local energy, advocacy from grassroots groups pushing those proposals, not by the Forest Service pushing them. That's just my take from experience and background. Let's see. Last thing, David. Go ahead.
Just going to say we're at a frustrating moment with Manchin and I mean, just finally getting a president whose at least climate is on the agenda, and then to have it stopped is deeply frustrating at this. I mean, that's what I guess when you asked what the book's about. I guess it's the literary equivalent of that movie that just came out, Don't Look Up. I mean, it's just it's just trying to grab you by the lapels and shake you and say, how can we not be doing something?
David, we're getting close to the top of the hour. Let's one last question here. Who are your conservation leaders for today? Who do you admire in the conservation movement today? And let's just leave it at that, and then we'll close out.
Well, I mentioned Regina, and I really thought the whole Dene Bakea group, so impressive what they did there. And at the time, a friend of mine, Amanda Podmore, was working for Friends of Cedar Mesa, and she's gone on to take a job with Grand Canyon Trust. And I just took a flight with them over the Grand Canyon. And one of the things that I think is really impressive about her is if I were doing my spew about hopelessness that I did about 5 minutes ago, she would have none of it. She's a terrier and a fighter, and she, and I do think we all have our, the old know thyself dictum is a good one. We all have our roles and our parts, and a large part of that is knowing what you do and what you excel at, and she excels at that. I'll also say that Grand Canyon Trust wasn't a diversity come lately organization. They had Native staff members for many years, and so it's good to see them out there doing their work for the Grand Canyon, and she's certainly one. And I continue to kind of cheer on Regina Lopez White Skunk, and I mentioned Dan Driscoll, who continues to be a hero of mine in New England, fighting the smaller fight there. So yeah, and I don't know. I will say that the great writers from the past, even the old white guys who inspired me, are a part of my daily conversation. I spend a lot of time talking to ghosts, and it's really a great thing to have books, including Roosevelt's own books, on these topics that you can go back to and see the fight in a longer term fashion than just day to day.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this conversation with David Gessner. That's been a fascinating look at the mind of a writer in this current conservation movement that we're working our way through. So David, thank you again from NWSA. We appreciate very much your time. Look forward to everybody to go out and buy one of David's books. Leave It As It Is, or the new book, the Quiet Desperation, Savage Delight, Sheltering with Thoreau in the Age of Crisis. A look at
and also please
handle.
Randy, feel free to give out my email to people interested in specific conservation. Okay. It's Gessner52.
All right.
I'm happy to respond. I always like to be part of the community.
You bet, and I would be happy to share that reading list as well. If you'd share that with me, we'll put that on our website.
I'll send it right to you right now.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody. We will be back on, I think, February 2nd for another NWSA webinar where we'll be looking at the National Wilderness Skills Institute, a recap, a review, and what we might see in the future for that particular event where we're doing summertime training virtually. So look forward to that conversation as well. So everybody, we'll see you next time. This is it for NWSA Today.